The security officer's words didn't just scare me. They rearranged my entire understanding of the universe in a single heart-stopping beat. Ma'am, we've identified anomalies in your luggage that test positive for illegal narcotics. I stood there, freezing in that sterile air-conditioned room behind the customs desk, staring at a grainy black and white monitor that was showing my life unraveling in real time. My new husband, Richard, the man I had married exactly 3 days ago in a chapel full of white lilies, didn't even flinch when they called my name over the airport speaker. He just checked his watch. But it was the other face on that screen that stopped my heart cold. My son Jake. My baby. I watched his eyes meet Richard's for just a split second on the footage, a quick, darting glance of panic and recognition, and that look told me everything I needed to know. They were partners. Standing alone in that terrifying security office, watching footage of them carefully placing wrapped packages in the lining of my blue Samsonite suitcase while I was supposedly taking a shower in the hotel room, I realized my perfect honeymoon had been the perfect setup. And the worst part wasn't the drugs. It wasn't the threat of a Mexican prison. It was the realization that the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college, the boy who was the only piece of my late husband I had left, had just sold his mother for a payout. I didn't scream. I didn't faint, though the edges of my vision went gray. I just stood there, gripping the cold metal edge of the interrogation table until my arthritic knuckles turned white, and I watched. The officer asked me something. Maybe asking if I wanted water, maybe asking if I knew what cocaine looked like. But I couldn't hear him over the roaring in my ears. I was looking at Jake's hands on the screen. Those were the hands I had held when they were tiny and sticky with jam. Those were the hands that had fumbled with a tie at his prom. And now those same hands were deftly tucking a brick of drugs behind my silk blouses. The betrayal wasn't a sharp knife. It was a dull, heavy weight that crushed the air right out of my lungs. I realized right then and there that the woman who had boarded this plane, the blushing bride, the proud mother, the hopeful widow, she was dead. She died in that room. And the woman who was about to walk out? She was someone entirely different. Someone who would have to survive the unimaginable to get justice. I didn't cry. Not yet. But tomorrow I would make them wish they had picked anyone else in the world but Lindy Morrison. If you're watching this from the comfort of your living room, maybe with a cup of tea in your hand, I need you to listen closely. Because if you've ever looked at the person you love most in the world and realized you were actually looking at a stranger, then you know exactly the kind of cold that settled into my bones that day. I need you to understand how I got here. How a 52-year-old school librarian, a woman who paid her taxes early and returned library books on time, ended up the target of a sophisticated criminal ring led by her own family. It didn't start with drugs or airports. It started with the most dangerous thing a woman my age can feel, loneliness. You know, that specific kind of quiet that fills a house after your husband passes and your children move out? That silence that hums in the walls? I had been living in that silence for 8 years. It was a physical weight, pressing down on me every evening when I set the table for one. 3 months earlier, Richard Calloway had swept into my world like something out of a paperback romance novel you'd find on the spinning rack at the grocery store. He was tall, with silver hair that caught the coffee shop lights and a smile that made you feel like the only person in the room. I was sitting in my usual spot at the Bean and Leaf, the one with the mismatched velvet chairs and the smell of burnt hazelnut, trying to lose myself in an Agatha Christie mystery so I didn't have to think about eating a frozen lasagna alone again. "Excuse me," he'd said, his voice smooth as velvet and deep as a cello, "but I couldn't help noticing you're reading The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. A woman of excellent taste." I had looked up, startled, to find the most attractive man I'd seen in years smiling down at me. He was wearing a suit that fit him perfectly, the kind that whispered money, and he held a cappuccino like he was posing for a magazine. I should have trusted my gut. That little voice in the back of my head that whispers danger when things seem too good to be true. I should have wondered why a successful contractor in his 50s, a man who clearly had money and charm to burn, was suddenly interested in a widowed school librarian wearing a cardigan she'd owned since the Bush administration. But darling, when you've been invisible for so long, being seen feels like sunshine after a long gray winter. Feels like oxygen. "I'm Richard," he'd said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Mind if I join you?" Within 2 weeks he was bringing me flowers, lilies my favorite, though I never remembered telling him that. Within a month, he was cooking dinner in my kitchen, filling my quiet house with the smells of garlic and rosemary and the sound of his laughter. And my son, my Jake, he watched it all. He watched from the corner of the living room, arms crossed, scowling like a teenager instead of the 28-year-old man he was. "Mom, don't you think this is moving too fast?" Jake had asked one evening after Richard left, staring out the window at Richard's Mercedes pulling away. "You barely know this guy. What if he's not who he says he is?" I remember smiling at him, walking over and touching his cheek, thinking he was just being protective. My sweet worried boy. I was still giddy from Richard's attention, still floating on that intoxicating feeling of being desired again. "Honey," I'd said, "when you've been alone as long as I have, you don't waste time when something good comes along. You grab it with both hands." Jake's expression had darkened then, a shadow passing over his face that I couldn't read. I thought it was concern. I thought he was worried about his old mom getting her heart broken. Now, looking back with the clarity of a survivor, I realize it was calculation. He wasn't worried about me getting hurt. He was worried about the timeline. He was worried about the payout. You see, Jake had been living with me since his divorce 2 years ago. He was my good boy. Or so I told my friends at the book club. He helped with the mortgage, fixed the leaky faucets, and ate dinner with me on Sundays. I thought we were a team. Us against the world. But staring at that security footage in the airport, I started to replay the last few months, and the signs were there, bright as neon lights. If only I hadn't been so blinded by love. The late-night phone calls he'd take outside on the porch, shivering in the cold, lowering his voice whenever I walked by. "Just work stuff, Mom," he'd say, quickly sliding his phone into his pocket. The way Richard would show up at the house when Jake wasn't there, asking casual questions about my routine, my finances, my insurance policies. "Lindy, you really should look into upgrading your life insurance," Richard had said one night over wine, holding my hand across the table. "I just want to make sure you're protected. We need to look out for each other now." And the way they both seemed so interested in the details of our Cancun honeymoon. Not the beaches, not the food, but the logistics. Which hotel we'd stay at. What time the flights were. And specifically exactly what our luggage looked like. "You should take the big blue suitcase, Mom," Jake had insisted. "It's sturdier. I'll even pack it for you. You do enough for me, let me do this for you." I had let him. I had thanked him. I had kissed his cheek and told him he was the best son a mother could ask for. God, the memory of that kiss burned my skin now. "Mrs. Morrison? Or is it Mrs. Calloway now?" Officer Martinez asked, pulling me back to the present nightmare. She was a young woman, maybe 30, with kind eyes but a jaw set like stone. She wore a uniform that looked too big for her, but she carried herself with an authority that terrified me. "We need to understand how much you knew about this operation." The way she said operation made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't some stupid mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was planned. This was orchestrated. And I was the unwitting star of the show. I had no idea. I told her, my voice barely steady, sounding like it was coming from underwater. "But you need to understand something about my son and my husband." She raised an eyebrow, her pen poised over her notepad. "They've been planning this from the beginning, haven't they?" The words tasted bitter as ash in my mouth, but saying them out loud made everything crystallize with horrifying clarity. It was like putting on a pair of glasses and finally seeing the cracks in the walls of my life. Officer Martinez nodded slowly, putting the pen down. "We've been tracking Richard Calloway for 6 months. This is his 4th marriage in 5 years. Same pattern every time. Whirlwind romance, quick wedding, honeymoon to a location known for drug trafficking. Then the wife becomes the unwitting mule." I felt my knees buckle, physically giving way under the weight of the truth. I grabbed the table to stop myself from sliding to the floor. She quickly guided me to a plastic chair, the kind you find in hospital waiting rooms where people receive bad news. "Mrs. Morrison, you're not in trouble. Not yet. You're a victim. But we need your help to understand how your son fits into this." My son. My baby boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, smelling of baby shampoo and fear. The child I'd sacrificed everything for after his father left us when Jake was 12. I had worked double shifts at the library and cleaned houses on weekends just to keep us afloat, to make sure he had braces and soccer cleats. I'd given up dating, given up my own dreams, given up everything to make sure Jake had stability, love, and a future. How long? I whispered, the question tearing at my throat like jagged glass. How long has Jake been working with Richard? Officer Martinez looked at me with pity, and that pity hurt more than her suspicion would have. Based on our surveillance, we believe they've known each other for at least 6 months before Richard approached you. 6 months. My perfect love story had been a business transaction from the very first moment. Before Richard had ever said hello to me in that coffee shop, before he had ever bought me a flower, he and my son had been sitting in a bar somewhere deciding how much I was worth. We have footage of them meeting at a bar downtown planning the approach, she continued gently. Your son provided detailed information about your routines, your vulnerabilities, your finances. He told Richard exactly what books you read, what coffee you drank, and exactly how lonely you were. I thought about all those evenings Jake had seemed so supportive of my relationship with Richard. Mom, you deserve happiness, he'd said, hugging me. Richard's good for you. You're glowing. I had been so grateful for his approval, so relieved that my 2 favorite men were getting along. The memory made me nauseous now. They had played me perfectly. They had used my own desire for love as a weapon against me. Your son was promised 30% of whatever they could extract from you, Martinez said, her voice clinical but gentle. Your life insurance, your house equity, your retirement savings. Richard specializes in widows and divorcees with assets but limited family connections. He calls them ghosts because if they disappear into the prison system, no one asks too many questions. She paused, studying my face, checking to see if I was going to break. Mrs. Morrison, did you recently update your will or insurance beneficiaries? My heart stopped beating for a second. 2 weeks after we got engaged, Richard had suggested we both update our wills to protect each other. He'd made it sound so romantic, so responsible. He'd even recommended a lawyer, his friend downtown. I had changed everything. My house, my life insurance, my retirement accounts, everything now went to Richard, with Jake as the secondary beneficiary. Oh God. I breathed, putting my head in my hands. If this smuggling thing had worked, if I'd been arrested, you'd be in federal prison for 20 years to life, Martinez finished for me. Your assets would be tied up in legal proceedings for years, eventually reverting to your beneficiaries once you were declared legally unable to manage them. Or worse. Worse. I asked, looking up. Mrs. Morrison, they weren't just using you to smuggle drugs. They were setting you up to lose everything, including your freedom. And often, in these cases, the mule doesn't survive the prison system. We believe there was a secondary plan involving a tragic accident, if the arrest didn't stick. I sat in that sterile chair, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of angry bees, and felt my entire identity crumble. I wasn't a beloved new wife. I wasn't a treasured mother. I was a mark, a target, a middle-aged woman whose loneliness and trust had made her the perfect victim. But as the shock began to wear off, something else started building in my chest. It started as a spark, hot and angry, and then it roared into a flame. Felt suspiciously like rage. It was the rage of every mother who has ever been taken for granted, every woman who has ever been underestimated. I need to see them, I told Officer Martinez. She looked surprised. Mrs. Morrison, I don't think that's advisable. They're being processed, and emotions are running high. I wasn't asking, I said, and the steel in my own voice surprised me. It was a voice I hadn't used since I was a young mother protecting her child from a bully. I need to see their faces when they realize their plan failed. 20 minutes later, I stood behind a two-way mirror, watching Richard pace frantically in an interrogation room while Jake sat slumped in a chair, head in his hands. Richard was still handsome, still charming, even in handcuffs. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The calculating coldness behind his practiced smile. The way his eyes constantly assessed and measured the room, looking for an angle, looking for a way out. Where's Linda? I heard him demand through the intercom. That was my real name, though everyone who loved me called me Lindy. Hearing him say it with such casual ownership made my skin crawl. She doesn't know anything. She's completely innocent. This is all a misunderstanding. I demand to see my lawyer. Even now, even caught red-handed, he was spinning the narrative, trying to paint himself as my protector. Jake finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. "She's going to hate me forever," he said to Richard, his voice cracking. "I told you this was too risky. I told you she wasn't as naive as your other wives." Other wives. The phrase hit me like ice water. How many women had they done this to? How many middle-aged hearts had Richard broken while emptying bank accounts and destroying lives? "Your son seems to have some regrets," Officer Martinez observed quietly beside me. I watched Jake wipe his nose with his sleeve, looking every bit the scared little boy I'd comforted through scraped knees and bad dreams. But he wasn't a little boy. He was a man who had looked me in the eye and lied to me every single day for 6 months. He was a man who had packed my suitcase with poison. "Not enough regret to stop him from betraying me," I replied, my voice flat. "Officer Martinez, what happens next?" She turned to face me fully. "For them? Federal drug trafficking charges, conspiracy, fraud. They're looking at serious prison time. For you." She paused. "That depends on what you want to do." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "We've been trying to catch Richard's operation for 2 years. With your testimony and cooperation, we can not only put him away but potentially identify other victims, maybe prevent future ones. But it will mean testifying against your son." I thought about other women like me, other lonely widows or divorcees who had fallen for Richard's practice charm, other sons who had sold out their mothers for 30 pieces of silver. I thought about the woman I had been yesterday, trusting, hopeful, foolish. I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save someone else. "What do I need to do?" "Testify," she said. "Help us understand the timeline, the manipulation tactics, the financial component. Your marriage to Richard gives us access to evidence we couldn't get otherwise." She paused, her expression softening. "Mrs. Morrison, this won't be easy. Your son will likely try to minimize his involvement, make you feel guilty for pursuing charges. Richard will try to convince you he really loves you, that he was coerced or threatened." Through the glass, I watched Richard check his expensive watch, the one I'd helped him pick out for our wedding as a gift. He told me it was a family heirloom he was getting repaired, but now I wondered how many other wives had heard that same lie. "When I married him 3 days ago," I said slowly, "I promised to love, honor, and cherish him. I promised for better or worse, for richer or poorer." Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically. "I understand if you need time to think about it. I also promised to be faithful." I interrupted, my voice growing stronger with every word. "And faithfulness works both ways." He broke those vows the moment he saw me as a mark instead of a wife. I turned away from the mirror. Decision made. When do we start? The old Lindy Morrison would have made excuses for them. She would have found ways to blame herself, tried to salvage the relationship at any cost, begged for an explanation. But that woman had died in this airport security office. The woman walking out of here was someone new entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones capable of hurting you the worst. And sometimes, just sometimes, they deserve exactly what they get. The next morning, I sat in Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen's office, wearing the same clothes I'd traveled in because everything else was still evidence. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best students back at the library. Her office was cluttered with files, stacks of paper that represented broken lives. "Mrs. Morrison, I've reviewed your case, and I want to be completely honest with you about what you're facing." She spread photographs across her desk. Pictures of Richard with 3 other women, all around my age, all looking blissfully happy on what appeared to be honeymoons. Margaret Stevens, 58. Married Richard in Atlantic City. Honeymoon in Jamaica. She's currently serving 15 years for drug trafficking. My stomach clenched. Margaret looked like my sister-in-law. A kind face, a little bit of gray hair. Patricia Williams, 55. Married him in Vegas. Honeymoon in Colombia. She died in federal prison last year from a heart attack. I stared at Patricia's photograph. She had kind eyes and graying brown hair. She looked like someone who baked cookies for her grandchildren. She was diabetic, Sarah continued quietly. Prison medical care wasn't adequate. Her family is suing, but that won't bring her back. The weight of what I'd escaped hit me like a freight train. That could have been my obituary. That could have been Jake reading about his mother's death in a federal prison cell. Mother of 1 dies in custody. The third woman, Carol Thompson, 62, was luckier. She became suspicious during the honeymoon and refused to pack anything she hadn't personally inspected. When customs found drugs in Richard's luggage instead of hers, she testified against him. But by then, he'd already emptied her retirement accounts and taken out loans against her house. She lost everything. Ended up homeless for 6 months before her sister took her in. Sarah leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. Your case is different because of your son's involvement. Jake has information about Richard's network that could help us catch the bigger fish. But he's also facing serious charges himself. The question is, are you prepared for the possibility that your son might go to prison for a very long time? I thought about Jake's face last night, how young and scared he'd looked. Then I thought about Patricia Williams dying alone in a prison cell, because her diabetic medication wasn't properly managed. I thought about the text messages I knew they must have exchanged about me, treating me like cattle to be sold. Sarah, can I ask you something? She nodded. Do you have children? Her expression softened slightly. A daughter. She's 7. If she were 28 and had betrayed you the way Jake betrayed me, what would you do? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I'd want to know why. I'd want to understand how it got to that point. And then I'd have to decide whether justice was more important than family. She paused. But Mrs. Morrison, that's a choice only you can make. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city courthouse. Somewhere in this building, Jake was probably meeting with a public defender, being advised to minimize his role, to blame Richard for everything. Part of me, the mother part, hoped he would. Part of me still wanted to protect the little boy who used to bring me dandelions. But another part of me, the survivor, remembered that little boy had grown into a man who had helped orchestrate my destruction for money. I want to see him, I said suddenly. I want to hear him explain it to my face. Sarah looked concerned. Mrs. Morrison, his lawyer will advise him not to speak with you. And honestly, it might not be the closure you're hoping for. She was probably right, but I needed to look into my son's eyes one more time. I needed to understand if there was anything left of the boy I'd raised, or if that person had been completely consumed by greed. Set up the meeting, I said firmly. If he won't talk to me, fine. But I'm going to give him the chance to tell me the truth. After 28 years of being his mother, I think I've earned that much. The jailhouse visiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. It's a smell you never forget. Cold, chemical, and sad. I sat across from Jake, separated by thick plexiglass, speaking through a crackling phone that made his voice sound hollow and distant. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept staring at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller than I remembered. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. How far did you want it to go, Jake? My voice was calmer than I felt. Did you think I'd just disappear quietly when you and Richard were done with me? He finally looked up, and I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before. Genuine fear. Not fear of consequences, but fear of who he'd become. It started as just information, he said, words tumbling out rapidly. Richard approached me at Murphy's bar. Said he was interested in you romantically. Wanted to know what you liked. How to make you happy. It seemed sweet. I held up my hand to stop him. When did it stop being sweet, Jake? His shoulders sagged. When he offered me money. Real money. $15,000 just for details about your finances, your routine, your vulnerabilities. $15,000. That's what my son's loyalty had cost. Less than the price of a used car. And when he offered more money to help with the smuggling operation, Jake's face crumpled. $50,000, Mom. He promised me $50,000 if I helped set it up properly. Do you know what that kind of money would mean for me? I thought about the college tuition I'd sacrificed my retirement savings for. The car payments I'd helped him with when he was unemployed. The down payment on his first apartment that had come from my emergency fund. I know exactly what $50,000 means, Jake. I've given you more than that over the years, and I never asked you to betray me for it. You don't understand, he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. You have the house, your pension, your savings. You're set for life. I'm 28, divorced, living in your basement, working construction jobs that barely pay minimum wage. I needed something, Mom. I needed a chance. So you decided to destroy mine? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. Jake, do you know what would have happened if their plan had worked? Do you know about Richard's other wives? His face went pale. What other wives? I told him about Margaret, Patricia, and Carol. I watched him realize that his get-rich-quick scheme would have resulted in his mother's death or imprisonment. Patricia Williams died in prison, Jake. She had diabetes and the prison medical system failed her. Is that what you wanted for me? $50,000 in exchange for your mother's life. He was crying now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the other women. Richard told me you just get probation, maybe community service. He said wealthy women never do real time for first offenses. The casual manipulation in Richard's strategy didn't surprise me, but it added another layer of revulsion to the whole situation. He had played on Jake's resentment and his naivety. Jake, I need you to understand something, I said, my voice steady despite the tears running down my own cheeks. I love you. I will always love you because you're my son. But love doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean consequences don't matter. He looked up sharply. You're going to testify against me. I'm going to tell the truth about Richard, about his operation, about how you helped him target me. I paused, choosing my words carefully. What you do with the opportunity to cooperate with the prosecution is up to you. But Jake, our relationship as it was? That's over. The mother who would have sacrificed everything to protect you? She died yesterday when I watched that security footage. He slammed his hand against the plexiglass. So that's it? 28 years of being your son, and you're just going to throw it away. I stood up slowly, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. You threw it away the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a mother. I hung up the phone and walked away, leaving Jake shouting my name through the glass. In the parking lot, I sat in the rental car Sarah's office had provided and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not grief or anger or betrayal, though all those emotions were still there. What I felt was freedom. Freedom from the burden of protecting people who were willing to destroy me. Freedom from the obligation to forgive the unforgivable just because we shared DNA. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard, somehow smuggled out through another inmate. Lindy, please come see me. I can explain everything. What we have is real. I deleted the message without reading it twice. Then I started the car and drove toward my new life, leaving the wreckage of my old one exactly where it belonged, behind me. Tomorrow I would start building something new. But tonight, I was simply going to appreciate being alive, free, and finally awake to what I was actually worth. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to finding out who I could become when I stopped trying to save people who were determined to drown me. 3 weeks into the investigation, Sarah Chan called me with news that made my blood run cold again. We found Richard's real operation base. Mrs. Morrison, this is bigger than we thought. I sat in my temporary apartment, a furnished studio the Victim Services Program had helped me secure, staring at the crime scene photos she brought over. The warehouse in Newark contained detailed files on over 50 women. Not just wives but targets. Ages, financial situations, psychological profiles, even notes about their deceased husbands and emotional vulnerabilities. My file was 3 inches thick. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to a note in Richard's handwriting. Lindy Morrison. Desperate for validation after 8 years alone. Responds to intellectual flattery and traditional romance gestures. Son Jake is financially struggling and emotionally dependent. Perfect leverage. Perfect leverage. That's what my relationship with my son had been reduced to. A weakness to exploit. But seeing it written out so clinically actually helped. It wasn't my fault for loving my child. It was their calculation to weaponize that love against me. Sarah, what's this column marked timeline to extraction? I asked, pointing to a chart with my name at the top. Richard's operational plan for your relationship. See here? Month 1 to 6. Establish trust and emotional dependency. Month 7 to 12. Legal entanglements and financial access. Month 13. Sarah paused. Month 13 was when you were supposed to die in federal prison, or from a medical emergency, while incarcerated. I studied the timeline with the detached fascination of someone reading their own obituary. He really had thought of everything. But as I read further, something didn't add up. Sarah, this says the smuggling operation was Plan B. What was Plan A? Sarah's expression darkened. Life insurance fraud. He was going to arrange an accident during your honeymoon. Make it look like you drowned while snorkeling or had a fatal allergic reaction. Much cleaner than the drug conviction route. But the timing got compressed when he found out about your upcoming medical checkup. My medical checkup? I was confused for a moment, then remembered. Oh, my annual physical. Dr. Richards wanted to update my prescriptions and run some routine tests. Sarah nodded grimly. Richard couldn't risk a doctor discovering any health issues that might complicate an insurance payout. So he switched to Plan B. Frame you for drug trafficking and let the justice system do his dirty work. I walked to the window processing this. Below, normal people were living normal lives, completely unaware that predators like Richard Calloway moved among them, cataloging weaknesses and planning destruction. How many women did he actually kill, Sarah? We're still investigating. But based on what we found so far, at least 7 confirmed deaths. Possibly more. Heart attacks in prison, suicides in custody. 1 car accident right before a trial that we now believe was staged. 7 women. 7 mothers, daughters, wives. Women who had baked cakes, read books, loved their children. Women like me. My phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Sarah nodded for me to answer and gestured to the recording equipment she'd brought. Hello. The voice was female, older, shaky with nerves. Is this Linda Morrison? The woman who was married to Richard Calloway? Yes. Who is this? I heard a deep breath, then words that made me sink into my chair. My name is Helen Rogers. Richard was married to my sister, Margaret, the one serving time for drug trafficking. Margaret Stevens, the woman from the photos. Helen, I'm so sorry about your sister. Mrs. Morrison. Margaret is innocent. We all knew it, but nobody would listen to us. But when I saw your story on the news, when I heard about his pattern, her voice broke. I need to know if you'll help me. If there's a way to save my sister before it's too late. I looked at Sarah, who was already pulling up files on her laptop. This wasn't just about justice for me anymore. This was about women who were still suffering for Richard's crimes. Helen, I said, my voice firm. Tell me everything. And yes, I'll help however I can. By the time Helen finished talking, I understood that my choice to testify wasn't just about punishing Richard and Jake. It was about saving lives. Margaret Stevens had already attempted suicide twice in prison. Carol Thompson was living in a homeless shelter. And somewhere out there, Richard's network was probably already targeting their next victim. Sarah, I said after Helen hung up, I want to do more than just testify. I want to help you catch all of them. 10 months later, I stood in a federal courtroom wearing my best Navy suit. The one I'd bought for job interviews after my husband died but never needed. Today, I was testifying against the man I'd promised to love until death do us part. The irony wasn't lost on me that death had almost done us part, just not in the way either of us had anticipated. Richard looked different in his orange jumpsuit. Smaller somehow. Without his expensive suits and practice charm, he was just another middle-aged criminal trying to convince a jury that everyone else was lying. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Graves, had tried every angle to discredit me during cross-examination. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you initiated the relationship with my client? She'd asked, pacing in front of the jury box. That you pursued him aggressively because you were desperate for companionship after 8 years alone? I had looked her directly in the eyes. Miss Graves, I was reading a book in a coffee shop. Your client approached me with a practice line about Agatha Christie that we now know he used on at least 6 other women. If you consider sitting quietly with a novel to be aggressive pursuit, I'd hate to see what you think actual flirtation looks like. Several jury members had smothered smiles at that. Patricia Graves had tried a different approach. You've admitted that you updated your will and insurance policies to benefit Mr. Calloway. Doesn't that suggest you were fully invested in this relationship? Not the victim of manipulation. Ms. Graves, when someone you trust convinces you to make them your beneficiary, and then tries to arrange your death or imprisonment, that's not investment. That's being set up. I paused, letting that sink in. Though I suppose from your client's perspective, The distinction doesn't matter much. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Jake's full cooperation. My son had agreed to testify against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. Watching Jake take the stand had been one of the hardest moments of my life. He looked thin and pale, wearing an ill-fitting suit that made him appear younger than his 28 years. When the prosecutor asked him to explain his role, his voice was barely audible. Richard recruited me 6 months before he approached my mother. He paid me to provide information about her habits, her finances, her emotional vulnerabilities. And did you know what Mr. Calloway intended to do with this information? Jake had looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. At first, I thought it was just romance stuff. But when he started asking about her life insurance policies and health conditions, he paused, swallowing hard. I knew something was wrong, but by then, he was paying me too much to walk away. Mr. Morrison, did there come a time when you learned that Mr. Calloway intended to harm your mother? Jake's composure had cracked completely. He told me she would just do a little jail time. He said wealthy women with good lawyers never serve real sentences for first drug offenses. I didn't know about the other wives who died. I swear I didn't know. The jury saw Jake for what he was: a weak man who had made terrible choices, but not the architect of a murder-for-profit scheme. During a recess, Jake approached me in the hallway. His public defender had probably advised against it, but he came anyway. "Mom, I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I need you to know that seeing those files, learning about what he did to other women, I realize now that I helped plan your murder." I studied my son's face, looking for any trace of the little boy I'd raised. What I saw was a man who had finally understood the true cost of his choices. "Jake, forgiveness isn't something I can give you right now. It's something you'll have to earn by living differently going forward." I paused. "But I'm glad you chose to tell the truth, even if it came too late to prevent the pain." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm going to get help, Mom. Therapy. I want to understand why I did it." "I hope you do, Jake. And I hope you find a way to live with yourself that doesn't involve hurting other people." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood with solemnity. "We find the defendant, Richard James Calloway, guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of drug trafficking." The charges kept coming. I watched Richard's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally empty resignation. Judge Patricia Wong, a stern woman with steel gray hair, had words for him before the bailiff led him away. "Mr. Calloway, in 30 years on this bench, rarely have I seen someone weaponize trust and love as systematically as you have. You didn't just commit crimes. You corrupted the most fundamental human connections. The sentence you receive will reflect that cruelty." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mrs. Morrison, how do you feel?" I looked at the cameras and spoke from the heart. "I feel relieved that Richard Calloway will never hurt another woman. But mostly, I feel sad that it took so many women suffering and dying for the system to take this seriously. This verdict is just the beginning." "What's next for you?" a reporter shouted. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure other women don't go through what I went through. There are patterns to this. Warning signs. I'm going to make sure people know them." That evening, I sat in my apartment with Helen Rogers and Carol Thompson. We were an unlikely sisterhood, survivors and families of victims. Carol had driven up from North Carolina. Helen had flown in from Michigan. "You know what the hardest part is?" Carol asked, picking at her Chinese takeout. "It's trusting myself again. How do I ever believe that someone actually cares about me?" Her question hung in the air. That was the real damage Richard had done. He had poisoned our ability to trust. But sitting there with these women, sharing stories and supporting each other, I realized something. Richard had tried to destroy our faith in people, but he had failed. We were connecting, healing, and building something real. "Maybe that's how healing works," I said softly. "Not by trusting blindly, but by building connections slowly with people who have earned it." My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Final verdict on the network prosecutions. All 8 defendants convicted. Judge Morrison got 20 years. Dr. Martindale, the insurance agent, got life without parole. Justice served. I smiled, pouring myself a glass of good wine. Richard was serving 4 consecutive life sentences. Jake was serving 3 years and learning to live with his choices. And I was here. Alive. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the women who hadn't made it, to the ones still fighting, and to the stubborn refusal to let evil win. Then I opened my laptop and started writing my next presentation. Because there was still work to do, and darling, I was just getting started. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever had to make the hard choice between family obligation and your own peace? Remember, darling, it's never too late to come home to yourself.